So, what I hope to do today is first make the case poetry belongs in spiritual care, that we'll look at it quickly at a mindful reading process, which many of you will already know as Lectio Divina or divine reading, that's been in use, came from Judaism actually into Christianity, and then has been in use with monks, starting with Benedict, the founder of the Benedictines, who really urged his monks to use this mindful reading process every day. And I call it mindful reading because some people are afraid of Latin, and this makes it easy for everybody to understand. And then we'll describe uses of selected poems in one-on-one visits that you might make. And we'll experience a few poems as examples of how they work away in us or in the person to, as I would say, to do God's work. All right. So again, if you have metrophobia, which is something we talked about earlier, there's actual name for fear of poetry. Hang in there with me, because as C.D. Wright said, I am completely convinced that poetry is nothing if not equipped for a crisis. And when you think about it, when do people reach for poems? Often at marriages, at funerals, baptisms, and so on. It's like when people know that there's something important needs to be said here, they often reach for a poem. So how do we know what kinds of poems will help us in our ministry? Well, if you're a chaplain, for example, you want to make sure that there's a good match between the poem and the patient. So I interviewed dozens of chaplains, clergy, spiritual directors, and individual grievers when I was doing the book, and the book was so deeply enriched by their wisdom. I want to give credit to that. It was very open sourced and in a beautiful and, I would say, providential way. And so several of the chaplains who are using poetry in ministry said to me, now make sure people understand that this is not a one size fits all. Just like you wouldn't go in and kind of hit somebody over the head with a scripture passage, or, insist that they pray with you in a certain way. You're using poetry in a tentative way, in an invitatory way. And you're always starting with conversation that helps you to kind of assess where the person's at, where does it hurt, what's the nature of their spiritual pain. And then if a scripture is the best message for that, if they're a believer already and deeply embedded in their church and have a whole history of the Psalms, for example, then that's probably the right avenue for that person. But what many that I interviewed said, and of course I was already aware of this because of the work of Diana Butler Bass, who I'm sure is known to many of you. Diana Butler Bass has really been an interesting writer in the last years about the future of the church and what's going to happen to churches as more and more people, which is what we're seeing, don't attend a church anymore, or might move in and out of churches, or they don't necessarily belong to the community, or there's deeply spiritual people, but nothing could persuade them to walk through the doors of a church because they've had a bad experience, or they're somehow allergic to traditional worship. And so she talks about, and I borrow her language, she talks about those people as the nones, N-O-N-E, not nuns in F, N-O-N-E, because when they're surveyed about what religion they follow, as often happens when you're hospitalized, for example, they check none. And that doesn't mean they're not spiritual. It means they don't consider themselves religious. So chaplains are really learning how to broaden their toolkit, because they're trying to help people find peace at end of life, and loved ones find peace with their deaths, who are increasingly atheists or agnostics or seekers, not maybe the traditional person that a chaplain may have ministered with 50 years ago. And so one of the reasons I'm on fire to spread the word about poetry as a tool, a powerful tool for us, I mean, I can certainly consider myself a Christian, in Christian ministry, is because we're often doing ministry with somebody who may not at all identify with any of the traditional majority religions in the United States. So here's the way the conversation often goes, according to chaplains I talk to. So, hi, I'm Chaplain Smith, and I'm here. I'd be happy to talk to you if you would like. And I wonder if there's a scripture or you'd like me to read, or would it be okay if I prayed for you? And increasingly, people will say, Well, chaplain, I really appreciate you visiting, but I don't really have anything I want to talk about. And all that religion stuff is not really for me. And so the chaplain knows that everybody has a spirituality, including this person in front of them, but the person might never use that language. And so when they get, can I read do scripture? No. If the person is Muslim, they'll say, would you like me to read from the Quran? Well, I'm not so sure. Would it be okay if I pray with you? Well, just tell me a little bit about what's going on with you, or how has it been for you since you've been in the hospital, or since you've been keeping this vigil with your loved one who's close to death. And then once they have a sense for the place that person is in, they might say something like, could I have some words here in my folder that have meant a lot to me and that I think might be helpful to you in the situation you've described. Would you like to hear them? And the answer almost 100% of the time is yes. So poetry seems to be able to open a door to spiritual conversation with many people that even, our beloved scriptures or other holy readings don't open for everyone evermore. And that's why I put up this quote by John Keats, that our skill then, what I'm going to unpack with you today, is that we want to choose a poem that's a good match between the person and the poem, so that the poetry strikes the reader, the person we're in dialogue with, as a wording of his own or her own highest thoughts and appear almost a remembrance. In other words, the gift poetry has to offer is that poets take so much time to wordsmith a poem, even one that's only a page long, is usually represents hours and hours and hours and hours of work and returns for revisions again and again before it's published. And that wordsmithing tends to result in distilled language that helps us to acknowledge something that we felt but couldn't say. So the whole idea here is, yes, yes, that's how I feel, or I get that. And then right alongside it comes the comfort of someone else has felt what I feel. So whereas most of us know that it's not that skillful to say, I know exactly how you feel, because that's very off-putting, coming up with a poem that may help to articulate what the person feels is a very powerful way of joining with that person, showing them you're safe, showing them you get it, and making them your partner in discussing whatever is on their minds or whatever their spiritual pain is. Now, in order to do this, we have to make sure that the tool we pick up, the poem we pick up, is not off-putting, because our whole goal here in using poetry instead of something more overtly religious is not to be off-putting and to meet the person where they're at. So I have a couple caveats, including that people in ministry, spiritual directors, chaplains, and so on, people in hospice work, should cautiously avoid poems that are sing-song. So no matter how much you love the poem from your childhood that was in your reader, I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree. That's not usually the kind of poetry that strikes a chord. Certainly with younger folk, if you're with a person who is your same age and who you think had the same reader, that might work. But in general, my 10 plus years of experimentation have shown me that people do a little bit more, they feel a little more comfortable with more informal, contemporary verse that just expresses thoughts but doesn't necessarily have a lot of rhyme and so on. Now, this is not a forever rule. No rule is hard and fast. And in my book, you'll find some that do rhyme and have regular meter, but they're very easy to access, and they don't sound like a greeting card. That's one of the problems with the sing-song poems, is they often sound like an inspirational greeting card. And those cards, even though I have a small collection of them that I've loved from my youth, like I bet a few of you received graduation cards that had the poem If on the front of it by Rudyard Kipling. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. It's very ennobling. It's very, it's lofty verse. I like Kipling, all right? But a lot of people don't. That's my point. And those poems tend to tell the hearer how to feel. So, I mean, listen to that. If you can do this, if you can do that, if you can, and the message is always rise above, take the high road. An important and beautiful message, one of the reasons I love it. But at the end, he says something like, you'll be a man, my son. It's funny that, I got that as a graduation gift. That's for Beware Then. And so it tells the person, do this and this and this and this and this, and then you can say you rose above it, or you fought the good fight, or etc. And when people are in the pits, when people are circling the drain, they don't often take well to being told how to feel, whether that's overtly or whether it's by implication. So if any of you have suffered losses yourselves, and I imagine you have, you probably know what I mean when people say, buck up, or get over it, or smile. You look so nice when you smile. It doesn't ever make you want to say, I've seen the error of my ways. How could I continue in my sadness? I should smile. I look so nice when I smile. Nobody does that. Instead, you kind of back slowly away from that person and think, boy, you really don't get it. So we don't want to be the person who really doesn't get it. We want to be that person who works on perfecting our presence, our skills of being really present to the person wherever they are, without judgment, and without trying to make them see the rightness of our position, but rather dealing with people in our own ministries, really the way God deals with us. When you're ready, you'll listen. When you knock, the door will open. I'm here. God doesn't force God's love on us. God doesn't force us to grow. Opportunities in life present themselves that invite us to grow. God doesn't like hold our head down in a basin while we're sputtering until we say, okay, I give up, I'm ready. And so we don't want to do that in ministry either. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but very occasionally it has become necessary to explain in this way. So I'm doing it.